Hello everybody, welcome back to the 4th episode of Artist Overviews, and today we're going to be covering Duke Ellington. Now, a few quick things to address before we start is that Duke Ellington has a very long discography. I was mentioning this before on the last episode with Sinatra, how it took me like a year to gather the notes and listen to all that music, the studio albums released by him. Duke Ellington's is actually a longer discography. So the fact I did it in such a short time surprised even me. And with that said, because he's also a slightly older artist, not all of his work is available. So there are some, not a lot, of albums that I weren't able to even find any information to or even find the track list for. So I really can't give you much on those albums besides the release date. Fortunately, most of them I was able to find. I'd say probably like a good 95% of them. And furthermore, like Sinatra, but to a greater intensity, Duke Ellington re-records a lot of his songs on multiple of his albums. So eventually I will compare and contrast like different versions of the same song, because that occurs often. And yes, that is just an important note to take into consideration. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Duke Ellington was born on April 29th in 1899 in Washington, D.C., USA. Both of his parents were pianists, and they surrounded him with a lot of musicians growing up. They also had a lot of racial pride, and his mom made sure to surround him with dignified women so that he learned to grow up with respect and well-treatment of everybody. He had several inspirations, specifically the biggest ones being Claude Debussy, Turner Layton, and Cliff Jackson, as well as Claude Hawkins. And before we start getting into the albums, I'd like to add one last note that, like with the Sinatra artist overview episode, I've curated a playlist of all the songs from his discography that I think are worthwhile to hear and that I consider essential listening. So if you're at all intrigued by that and perhaps would like to actually hear some of the songs I mentioned throughout this video, specifically the better ones, which are a lot, it's almost 100 songs, I will leave a link for that in the description, or actually probably a comment. So you'll see it. I'll pin the comment. Anyways, in 1947, Duke Ellington released his first studio album titled Duke Ellington Plays the Blues. It was released by RCA Victor, and the recordings sound surprisingly good. They're short but sweet with solid blues instrumentals. And like I said, there's not going to be a lot of information on these earlier ones. So I'm just going to try and recommend you 3 songs from each album going forward. And hopefully that will suffice. For this album, the 3 songs I recommend are Pretty Woman, St. Louis Blues, and the Royal Garden Blues. In the same year of 1947, he released his second album, Ellington Special, which was his first record recorded on Columbia. And unfortunately, this was the first instance of one of his records that I just couldn't find anywhere. So I can't really give any feedback on it, unfortunately. And by the same principle, I can't really give any song recommendations. The next year, in 1948, Duke Ellington recorded the Liberian Suite. This album was commissioned for the Liberian Centennial, the celebrating of 100 years of Liberia, and his first international commission. It has good flow and nice strong structure that makes it come across as a concept album almost, especially with the suites. It has very nice vocals on I Like the Sunrise, contributed by Al Hibbler, and because of that, it is my first song recommendation, I Like the Sunrise, along with Dance Number 4 and Dance Number 1. 3 years later, in 1951, he released Masterpieces, by Duke Ellington. This is his first full-length LP, and it also features superb vocals by Eve Duke. I'd also like to say that he has a great taste for vocalists. Most of the vocalists he hires and brings in do a great job, and often surprise me in a pleasant way. The 3 songs I'd recommend for this album are Mood Indigo, Solitude, and Sophisticated Lady. The following year, in 1952, Ellington Uptown was released. This features some extreme highs for Ellington, such as Take the A Train and the Harlem Suite, which has become some of his most successful tracks, and also some of his most recorded tracks. Like I said with the other album, because of that, the first song I recommend is Take the A Train. I'd also recommend Skin Deep and The Mooch. In the following year of 1953, Premiered by Ellington was released. It was his first release on Capitol Records, and though Stormy Weather, the track, is phenomenal, the rest of the tracks are kind of just standard smooth jazz, and they almost blend together. It's a critique of Ellington's you'll see I have a lot throughout his career, mostly because I've listened to so much Ellington that there are certain phases and eras of his works that all kind of blend together if they're dominated by an instrument or 2 instruments, specifically piano and horns for him. From this album I'd recommend, though, Stormy Weather, 3 Little Worlds, and Liza. In the same year of 1953, he released The Duke Plays Ellington. This is a pleasant listen, but again, most of the songs sound the same. They're all key-based and usually slow, except the 2 tracks. So much so that it's quite easy to forget what track you're currently listening to while having the album on. The 3 tracks I'd recommend for this album are Reflections in D, Dancers in Love, and In a Sentimental Mood. The next year, in 1954, he released Dance to the Duke. Again, unfortunately, this was another album that I couldn't find anywhere, so I don't really have any input to give on it whatsoever. So let's just jump into the next one. In 1955, he released Ellington 55. This one mixes it up between songs, which I duly appreciate. It can make it hard to follow sometimes and exposes some holes, but overall it's a good listen. I'd recommend Flying Home, Black and Tan Fantasy, and In the Mood. In the same year, he released Ellington Showcase. Again, sorry, this is another album I just couldn't find it on any streaming services or anywhere, nor really any information about it at all. Again, a lot of albums, a lot of dispersion, I guess. In the following year, 1956, he released Blue Rose. This was his first record back on Columbia for a while. It was a collaboration with Rosemary Clooney, who is one of his first uses of overdubbing. Her vocals are incredible, and they complement Duke's instrumentals perfectly, in my opinion. They have amazing chemistry, and together they made a near-perfect album. The 3 tracks I recommend on this album are Hey Baby, Grieving, and I'm Checking Out, Goodbye. In 1956, he released Historically Speaking. This album has somewhat of a disorganized flow, but is technically amazing. Mostly featuring similar sounding songs, but a strong listen for pure jazz enthusiasts. The 3 songs I'd recommend are Lonesome Lullaby, East St. Louis, Toodaloo, and The Jeep is Jumpin'. Within the same year, he released Duke Ellington Presents. This one received mediocre reviews at the time of release, and though I think it's strong, with good sequencing, and it actually features a really nice, powerful end track. Because of that, I'll recommend Summertime, It Can't Get Started, and Everything But You. The next year, Duke Ellington released the first album of his that I consider completely perfect, and that would be A Drum Is a Woman, released in 1957. It's a collaboration with his long-term co-writer, Billy Strayhorn. It recounts the story. Well, it's a concept album, first of all, I should address that. It recounts the story of Madame Zaj, the personification of African rhythm, and Caribbean Joe. The album tells the story of Zaj venturing around the world in hopes of attaining fame and influence, and cultures which make up her story. It was produced for television on the United States Steel Hour. It was very strongly reviewed, and it is definitely out there. Personally, I love it. And the concept of musical consciousness is a beautiful one. Not every song on this is perfect individually, but as a whole, I think they create a perfect product. It's also mixed and narrated very well. I'd recommend off this one Caribbean Joe, Madame Zaj, and Zaji's Dream. In 1957, after that, he released Such Sweet Thunder. It's a 12-part suite based on the work of Shakespeare and was inspired by the Stratford Shakespearean Festival in Canada, which actually made him make this album as a tribute to that. He actually he played the entire suite at the 1957 edition of that festival, and apparently it was all written in just under 3 weeks, which is quite impressive. It definitely picks up in the second half, and it's relatively well paced. A good album. The 3 tracks I'd recommend are The Star-Crossed Lovers, Madness in Great Ones, and Half the Fun. In that same year, he released Ella Fitzgerald Sings the Duke Ellington Songbook, a collaboration with him and the eminent Ella Fitzgerald. It was their first album collaboration of many, and was part of her Songbook series, in her first attempt to fully exhibit scat singing, which is a form of vocal improvisation using ad-libs. It's very interesting, and I personally find it quite fascinating. It won the Grammy Award for Best Jazz Performance, and it began a fruitful artistic relationship for the two. It's a pretty long album. It's 38 tracks long, and it features 2 volumes, the first done with the Ellington Orchestra, and the second done in a small group setting. The first 3 sides are essentially flawless, in my opinion, with great instrumentation and vocals, and it really seems like they're having a lot of fun recording. Although that last side does definitely dip in quality, in my opinion, and probably didn't have to be included on the release. But that's just me. Still a great album, and I'd recommend Drop Me Off in Harlem, Daydream, and Caravan. The next year, in 1958, he released Black, Brown, and Beige. This one features Mahalia Jackson, and it's a revised version of a 3-part suite that was cut down and segmented after negative critical response. The vocal tracks on this one are quite good, and Mahalia's unconventional voice thrives, I think. The 3 tracks on this I'd recommend are Part 4, Part 3, and Part 1. That same year, in 1958, Ellington released Ellington Indigos. This one is compiled of many similar sounding jazz tracks, and to be honest, I actually prefer the bonus tracks on this one to the actual track listing, and it's definitely not my favorite because of such. But it's still well made and well done. Of course, Ellington's a splendid artist and he knows how to create great sounding music. The 3 songs I'd recommend off this are Prelude to a Kiss, Tenderly, and Solitude. In that same year, 1958, he released Duke Ellington at the Bell Masque, which is made up of operetta songs. It's about the Bell Masque Supper Club, where the Ellington band played in the past. Unfortunately, I couldn't find this album, so I can't really provide any extra information aside from that, or give any kind of response on the track listing or the sound of it at all. But in that same year, he released The Cosmic Scene, which I did find, and it features a nonette, his spaceman, which provided a compelling performance, though it lacks variety. And it's a shame that his band aren't higher in the mix on this one, because they really sound great. The 3 tracks I recommend on this are the St. Louis Blues, Jones, and Basement. The next year, in 1959, he released Jazz Party. This one features a strong lineup of guests, including Dizzy Gillespie and Jimmy Rushing, Count Basie's former vocalist. It was long praised for its percussions, and there's a lot of innovation contributed from each member. The suite comes off as a little disjointed, in my point of view, but there are a lot of groovy horn parts, and there's definitely a lot here to grab onto if you like any of those artists. The 3 tracks I'd recommend are Hello Little Girl, Sad and Dull, and Toot Sweet. In that same year of 1959, he released Back to Back, one of his 2 albums released in the same year, collaborating with Johnny Hodges. And it serves as a combo piece actually with the other albums Side by Side, which is his next release. They were both recorded in the same session, and in my opinion, this one's one of his weaker albums, and lacks a little bit of personality, but does, however, feature some badass horn exchanges, no doubt. The 3 tracks I'd recommend on this one are Weary Blues, Basin Street Blues, and St. Louis Blues. The next release of his was the aforementioned Side by Side, also collaborating with Johnny Hodges. And this one is definitely more of a Johnny Hodges album. Ellington only appears on 3 of the tracks, and for whatever reason it's remained perpetually in print. It's horn dominated primarily, with some decent bass on some tracks and a beautiful guitar on Squeeze Me. Every time Duke uses guitars on his tracks, I find that they're just used extremely well, and I don't know, he has good selection for them. He knows when to implement them. Because of that, I'd recommend Squeeze Me, Stompy Jones, and Ruined. In 1959, he released Anatomy of a Murder. This was his first soundtrack album to the film of the same name. It won 3 Grammy Awards in 1959 for Best Performance by a Dance Band, Best Musical Composition, and Best Soundtrack. It really does have some very flavorful songs, but it's extremely disjointed when heard isolated from its film counterpart, and I wouldn't listen to it at all unless you were watching that film, which makes sense because it was made for that film. The 3 songs I recommend on it are Happy Anatomy Part 5, Main Title / Anatomy of a Murder, and Hop or Hoppe, depending on how you pronounce that. His final album, released in 1959, a really big year for him in terms of releasing albums, was Festival Session. Apparently he recorded this whole album from 8 a.m. to noon and was described as a classic sleeper. and I mildly agree. I think it's consistent as a whole, but it does feature some great moments that do stand out. The 3 songs I recommend off this one are Idiom 59 Part 2, Things Aren't the Way They Used to Be, and Cop Out Extension. Duke Ellington's first album of the 1960s was Blues in Orbit. It's described in liner notes as a primarily blues album, which lives up to the title. It's a strong one in my opinion. There's a lot of variety opposed to his last few albums, which in my opinion was much needed and is very refreshing to hear. It's more selective and less dominating instrumentally by single instruments. I think the blues genre really helps him in that, creating some diversity throughout his band. Specifically, the 3 instruments that are featured along this one are horns, bass, and violin. And it really is a strong album overall that I would recommend checking out. The 3 tracks I'd recommend off it are Blues in Orbit, 3J's Blues, and Pi I Blues. His second album, released in 1960, is the Nutcracker Suite, which was recorded for Columbia Records jazz interpreters of the 1892 ballet The Nutcracker by Tchaikovsky. This album is good, but it doesn't add enough to the original Nutcracker Suite, in my opinion, to be worth listening over it. With that said, I'd recommend Sugar Rum Cherry, Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, Overture, and Peanut Brittle Brigade March. His final album of 1960 was Piano in the Background, another 2-part album run which will be continued very soon. This one's nice, and it really does become appropriate to the title, as I think it's a really good background listen, especially if you like piano. It has some lesser versions of his previously recorded tracks, but I mean, it lives up to the title. You're getting what you want. You're getting what you expected. So it is strong. And the 3 songs I recommend are I'm Beginning to See the Light, Happy Go Lucky Local, and What Am I Here For? In the next year of 1961, he released Swinging Suites. The Royal Swedish Academy of Music made a statement that this album was offending to the Nordic music culture. Because of this, Ellington respectively withdrew the album immediately. Though it was still well received, the feel was somewhat unoriginal, but the suite is well done, and I don't know, the covers seemed a little bit derivative, I can't lie, so maybe the Royal Swedish Academy of Music had a point. The 3 songs I recommend are Sweet Thursday, Solveig's Song, and Anita's Dance. In 1961, he released the combo to Piano in the Background, Piano in the Foreground. This one features Ellington in a piano trio setting. The title on this one's somewhat misleading, as it actually feels a lot like the past album, in terms of I think that the piano tunes would fit better in the background. And it's definitely my lesser favorite of the 2. It's somewhat oversaturated his discography at this point when it was released as well, which definitely is not a point in its favor. The 3 tracks I recommend from it are Congo, 100 Dreams Ago, and I Can't Get Started. In the same year of 1961, he released The Great Reunion. This album features the legendary Louis Armstrong, and is one of the biggest collaborations in musical history. It also kicks off his kind of collaboration era, where he begins to work with a whole plethora of really big names. Louis contributes some great vocals here and really makes the album stand out amongst his other albums in the discography. Though overall I think it's somewhat of a letdown in terms of the gravity of the names involved. The 3 songs I recommend are Azalea, don't get around much anymore, and it don't mean a thing if they don't got that swing. In the same year of 1961, they released Together Again, which was another collaboration between Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Though unfortunately I couldn't find this one anywhere, nor much information about it, so I can't really talk about it that much. The album released after that, also in 1961, was First Time, The Count Meets the Duke. Another legendary team-up here with Count Basie this time around. Duke goes all out on this one, but I think Count Basie holds back somewhat, for whatever reason. Though it's still a great product, and obviously a jazz standard. I'd recommend Wild Man, To You, and Seguin. His final album, released in 1961, was Paris Blues. This one's another soundtrack. And he actually did also work on this one with Louis Armstrong. But I couldn't find the isolated music on streaming, so I can't really provide any commentary nor recommendations for this one either. I promise that's going to stop happening soon. In the following year of 1962, his first release in 1962, is All American in Jazz. This album features recordings based off the 1962 theater musical All American. Again, unfortunately, it's another one I just couldn't find anywhere. I feel like it might have something to do with the soundtrack nature of some of these, but that's just me. His second and final album released of that year, 1962, is Midnight in Paris. This album's great. The performances and compositions are inspired by Paris. Most of these songs are perfect, with only a few mediocre ones interspersed between. I'd recommend I Wish You Love, Comme Si Comme Ça, and Speak to Me of Love. The next album, his first release of 1963, is Duke Ellington meets Coleman Hawkins. This one's obviously a collaboration with Coleman Hawkins, as mentioned in the title. It's great and it flows very well. It doesn't feature any hits, but it's still a lovely listen overall. I'd recommend The Jeep is Jumpin', The Rickatic, and Ray Charles Place. The next album released in 1963 was yet again another huge collaboration, probably the biggest one in his career in my opinion, Duke Ellington and John Coltrane. This album is perfect. I think it's almost inarguable, but that's just me. It features John Coltrane, obviously, and it's a collection of Ellington standards. Of the album, Coltrane said he was honored to work with Duke, and that he had a high set of standards. This album is just perfect in so many ways, and it features some of the most quintessential jazz ever made. Listen to every track for this one, that's my recommendation, but if you want the three I find the best, I would say In a Sentimental Mood, My Little Brown Book, and The Feeling of Jazz. Check this one out, really. The next one in the same year, another perfect album, one of the few in his discography released, is Money Jungle. Also check this one out. This is another huge team-up, this time with Charles Mingus and Max Roach. All the compositions on this were written by Duke, and it has been mostly well received, with a few critics being off-put with the different playing styles of Mingus and Ellington. Probably because Mingus focused more on bop jazz, where Ellington was just more jazz. And they also had quite a big age disparity between the two. Though I think that added to the work, and I think that made it just even better. This isn't actually the first time Ellington worked with Mingus either. They worked together in 1953, but Mingus got fired for getting into a physical altercation with Juan Tizol. But this album's great. That doesn't even matter. Mingus's bass pairs perfectly with Ellington's piano, and together it's just a perfect product. Again, I recommend every track on this, but if I had to choose three, Money Jungle, Warm Valley, and very special. In the same year, the last album released of 1963 is Afro-Bossa. This is a really strong album, and it adds to his great album streak. It features some great African-influenced drums and horns, and the 3 tracks I'd recommend off it are Bonga, Purple Gazelle, and Angu. The next year, we saw Duke release the Symphonic Duke Ellington in 1964. On this, he works with the Paris Symphony Orchestra, and unfortunately, in my opinion, it snaps his phenomenal album streak. For me, I think these songs come across as repetitive, mediocre, and dragged on just a little bit too long. With that said, I'd recommend Night Creature, Second Movement, Stalking Monster, Night Creature, First Movement, Blind Bug, and Night Creature, Third Movement, Dazzling Creature. In 1965, Duke Ellington released My People. My People was recorded 2 years earlier in 1963 for a stage show presented in Chicago. And it's a decent listen on its own. It's got some interesting and weird vocal choices. I'd recommend Working Blues, Come Sunday, and My Mother, My Father. His second album released in 1965 was Will Big Bands Ever Come Back? This is another example of an album I just couldn't find anywhere, so again, not much I could say about it, unfortunately. Though, in the same year, he released Ellington 65, obviously in 1965. It features covers of popular tunes, and reviewers liked it, but noted it's definitely not required Ellington listening. Very mediocre and dragged out. The 3 songs I'd recommend are I Left My Heat in San Francisco, The Peking Theme, and The Pecking Theme, and Never on Sunday. In that same year, he released Duke Ellington Plays Mary Poppins in 1965. This one was released in tandem with the Mary Poppins film, and reviewers noted it as impressively memorable. I think this album struggles a little bit if listening to isolated of the film, but it's okay. I think the part that irks me the most is that there's a noticeable lack of bass strewn throughout this album. The 3 songs I recommend are A Spoonful of Sugar, Sister Suffragette, and Step in Time. Again in 1965, Ellington released Ellington 66, which won a Grammy for Best International Jazz Performance. Critics agreed, and I also agree, that it bested his 65 previous release, Ellington 65, and that's a far more accessible Ellington album than most of his catalog. All the songs are decent at worst, and his covers change enough on this where I think they elevate the source material and they become equally pleasurable listens. I do recommend this one. Check out All My Loving, Red Roses for a Blue Lady, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. His final release of 1965 is Elle at Duke's Place. This is another perfect album released by him in my opinion, and it's the second collaboration between him and Ella Fitzgerald. It's a complete success. It was nominated for the Best Female Pop Performance at the 1967 Grammys. And it seemed like they really take over here. They come into their own. Incredible performance given by both. And it's an essential listen for both their catalogs. Check out Azure, Passion Flower, and I Like the Sunrise. But also just check out the whole album. It's phenomenal. The next year, he released Serenade to Sweden in 1966. This album is spectacular, with many perfect tracks, only weighed down by some mediocre ones. It has great vocals featured all throughout, with some beautiful horns and piano parts. I'd recommend on this one The Boy in My Dreams, Stuna, and La Dee Doody Do. I know. Funny titles. In 1967, he released yet another perfect album, in my opinion, the Far East Suite, which was inspired by him and his band's tour of Asia. Ellington wrote the Far East Suite because of that, and because of a lot of the tours he played there. And he wrote it along with Billy Strayhorn, who actually passed away this year. A lot of people think this should be called the Near East Suite because it omits a lot of influence from a lot of further east countries. Regardless, it won a Grammy in 1968 for the Best Instrumental Jazz Performance. And though it doesn't feature a lot of influence from east countries, it does, however, feature one song, particularly Isfahan, I believe, that does. And along this tour, where they were playing this, they were actually supposed to play in the United States, but right when they were about to have their concert, the day before, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, so they had to cancel it. Isfahan has become a jazz classic since, and many people consider it to be Duke's greatest ever work. It's undeniably fantastic. And this whole album, and a lot of these themes that he was doing around this time, really push him outside his comfort zone, and I think he really excels when that happens. Again, I think it's a perfect album, and I strongly recommend it, as well as all the tracks, to most Ellington fans, or Ellington enthusiasts. The three songs I think are the best, though, are Tourist Point of View, Isfahan, and Mount Harissa. His second album in 1967 was the popular Duke album. This album consists of mainly, in my opinion, worse covers of his older songs. They're still done well, but I think they've just been done better before by him and others. With that said, the three songs I'd recommend are The Twitch, Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me, and Creole Love Call. In the next year of 1968, he released And His Mother Called Him Bill. This album and the title was recorded in tribute to Billy Strayhorn, who, as I mentioned, passed the year before. It won a Grammy for the Best Large Jazz Ensemble album in 1968, and it's mostly horn and piano prominent, which likens it to a plethora of a lot of his other albums in his discography. Because of this, it does get kind of repetitive, but it's still a sweet album, and I appreciate the tribute factor of it. The three songs I recommend are Rock Skippin' at the Blue Note, Snybor, and Buddha. In the same year, we see perhaps the two biggest names in jazz at the time collaborate, and the album is Francis A. and Edward K. I talked about this one already on my Sinatra episode, but I think that they kind of didn't reach expectations for how great they are and how big their names are. And even they have been said themselves to have given uneven performances on this album. But it still won Best Album of the Hi-Fi Stereo Review month of May in 1968. And it features a few amazing classics. But it's still somewhat of a letdown. But with that said, it's a great album, so check it out anyways, because it's phenomenal. The three songs I recommend are Sunny, I Like the Sunrise, and Yellow Days. His final album of 1968 was the Second Sacred Concert. Ellington cited these concerts as the most important things he has ever done, and that he was not attempting to compose a mass with these recordings. Obviously, I'm including his other two live performances in this sect. He performed this in Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and he hosted a Festival of Grace there. The concert was aired live on television, and the song In the Beginning God won a Grammy in 1967. It was described as the spirit of universality, and it was premiered at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, where Duke Ellington was later had a funeral for himself. It featured large contributions from Alice Babs as well, who did a great job, in my opinion. The 3 songs I recommend are Heaven, TG, TT, and Praise God and Dance. Duke Ellington then released his first album of the 70s, New Orleans Suite. This one's widely considered a classic by many, and it contains the final recording, of Johnny Hodges, who died in between these sessions. It won the Grammy in 1971 for Best Jazz Performance by a Big Band. It was also commissioned by George Wein for the 1970 New Orleans Jazz Festival. It was receptive of many favorable reviews, and it features a lot of perfect tracks and marks the start to a more variety and change in Ellington's albums. The 3 songs I recommend off it are Portrait of Mahalia Jackson, Portrait of Wellman Broad, and Aristocracy of La Jean Lafitte. In the same year of 1970, he released Orchestral Works. This album is not good, in my opinion. The orchestra parts dragged on too long, and the spoken word didn't compensate. It also lacked cohesion, despite the strong performances throughout. Its fatal flaw is that it just goes on too long. And it also features the worst version of Harlem that I've heard on an Ellington album so far. I don't recommend this one at all. The 3 songs I do recommend off it, though, are Stanza 3, The Handsome Traffic Policeman, it's all one song, New World A-Comin', and Stanza 2, The Green Apple. 2 years later, he released Latin American Suite in 1972. This one received favorable reviews. It's a mixed bag of an album, and the first 3 songs aren't great, but every song after is phenomenal, and you really begin to hear the Latin influence at that point. It also, in my opinion, features some African influence, specifically percussively. Along with that, it has some of the best song outros of Duke Ellington's career. The 3 songs I recommend are The Sleeping Lady and The Giant Who Watches Over Her, Latin American Struggle, and Tina. The next album, released in 1973, is This One's for Blanton. This album features Ray Brown, and the title of this album is a tribute to the double bass player Jimmy Blanton. It received favorable reviews, and it contains some fabulous bass playing, likely attributed to Blanton, and in my opinion it features the best bass of all of his albums, which I really appreciate because I like bass. It has a few standout songs and is overall pretty strong. I'd recommend Fragmented Suite for piano and bass, Movement 2, Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me, and CC Rider. In the same year, he released It Don't Mean a Thing If It Don't Got That Swing. This album exhibits a team-up between Ellington and Teresa Brewer. This is another one of those few albums I consider perfect, and another one of those vocalists I think just suit Ellington's style so well. Teresa Brewer probably ranks up there with Ella Fitzgerald, in my opinion. She pairs perfectly with instrumentals, and the last track is mildly questionable, but it does finish on a strong note. I highly recommend this album, every song, but again, if you had to know my favorite 3, it would be Mood Indigo, It Don't Mean a Thing If You Ain't Got That Swing, and I Ain't Got Nothing But the Blues. In 1974, he released recollections of the big band era. This one was recorded by Bruce Swedian at the Universal Recording Corporation in Chicago. The album received mediocre reviews and was described as laid back. In my opinion, it's also incredibly mid and repetitive and not worth checking out. The 3 songs I recommend from it are Minnie the Moocher, It's a Lonesome Old Town, and The Midnight Sun Will Never Set. In that same year of 1974, Duke released his final album while alive, Duke's Big Four. This album was a combination of many players, specifically Joe Pass, Ray Brown, and Louis Bellson. Despite its slow start, it picks up by song 3 and establishes itself as a good lounge listen. It's purely instrumental and filled with solos and blues. A good listen if that's your style. Check out Love You Madly, The Hawk Talks, and Prelude to a Kiss. Duke's first posthumous album released was The Pianist, and in my opinion it's quite a strong one. It received favorable reviews upon its initial release, and though being single instrument based, I think it is diverse enough between songs and different enough between songs that it is still very strong. It has a lot of great solos and quite a few bangers interspersed throughout. In my opinion, a must listen for piano players. Check out Looking Glass, The Shepherd Take 1, and The Shepherd Take 2. The next year, in 1975, he released the Afro-Eurasian Eclipse. It was one of the many world music influenced suites composed at the same time in the final decade of his life. It was favorably reviewed upon release, and it's a well-done album with some of his most beautiful and sonorous horn parts. I was thoroughly impressed. Check out Didgeridoo, Oct O'Clock Rock, and Tang. The next year, in 1976, he released Jazz Violin Sessions, which were actually recorded in 1963. Svend Asmussen plays viola throughout this entire session, and is probably the main standout of it. It is his only violin-centric studio album, and it's executed quite well. Many of the songs do unfortunately kind of blend together, but they do work well still as a complete product. It's very instrument heavy, as you could tell by the title, and it's certainly a blues-based album, but it's pretty good overall. I'd recommend String Along with Strings, Blues in C, and Tricky Licks. In that same year, we received the Ellington Suite. This album is an amalgamation of 3 suites recorded between 1959, 1971, and 1972. It won a Grammy for Best Jazz Performance in 1976, and Ellington and Strayhorn wrote the Queen Suite for Queen Elizabeth II, who received a single pressing of it upon recording before it was actually released to the public. It received negative reviews though, and I moderately agree. I think it's amongst his worst studio albums, mostly because there are no real standout tracks or even good ones, in my opinion. With that said, I'd recommend The Single Petal of a Rose, Fanfare, and La Sucrière Velours. In 1977, Duke Ellington released the Intimate Ellington. This album is very good. From the eerie start of it, aka the intro, to the fantastic second side of the album, it features a lot of bangers. The second and third tracks don't do a lot for me. In fact, I think they kind of hurt the album as they stagnate the flow somewhat. Despite that, though, every other song is incredible and near perfect. I'd recommend Moon Maiden, Eulb, and Sophisticated Lady. In 1979, Duke Ellington released the Unknown Sessions. These were recorded in 1960 but not released until, like I said, 1979. It received favorable reviews. Personally, I was very excited to hear this album. Both the title and the cover somewhat intrigued me, as they had a mysterious, kind of like undefined energy coming out from them, but it somewhat lived up to my expectations. Some songs were pretty good, and others were certainly not. It's wholly instrumental and contains some really flavorful horns, but it gets repetitive towards the end. It also has some nice beats though. And I'd recommend Don't You Know I Love, or Don't You Care to Know, as well as Dual Highway and Mood Indigo. Duke's final release of the 70s is Up in Duke's Workshop, released in 1979. This album received negative reviews and was deemed nearly completely unessential. It's purely instrumental and doesn't feature much that we haven't heard from Ellington before, bar Neil Creel, which is amongst his best and is actually just amazing. It sounds like it could come straight off his film score and work perfectly independently despite that. Obviously, all these songs were recorded before Ellington passed, but it's still an album, and it must be held to the standard of an album, even with its considerations and caveats. I'd recommend Neil Kroll off this one, Mendoza, and Wanderlust. Between this and the next album, there was a 6-year period of no releases, until 1985, where Duke Ellington released featuring Paul Gonsalves. This one was actually recorded in 1962 and not released until 1985 by Fantasy Records. Robert Kreisgau noted that Gonsalves' performance on this actually impressed him. I thought it was quite mediocre personally. I mean, it's novel to see some collaborative tracks at this stage in his career, but it appears as if Ellington's estate was kind of running dry at this point in terms of unreleased material. Still some strong songs, but overall imbalanced. I'd recommend Ready, Go, Jam with Sam, and Caravan. In the following year of 1986, Duke Ellington released The Intimacy of the Blues. This album really surprised me, and it actually made me kind of eat all the comments I just made on that last album, because it's great. It features some of the best tracks of his career, and they're mixed astonishingly well. The second side particularly kicks ass. It has some great blues tracks with a lot of organ, which is a novelty to see for Ellington, and something I really appreciate as someone who likes some organ. It's very cool and refreshing overall. Definitely one of his stronger late career releases. Off it, I'd recommend Soul Country, New Mooning, and Rock O'Shea. Duke Ellington's final release is 2004's The Jaywalker. This album is a pretty long one, featuring tracks recorded in 1966 and 67, and was released to the Storyville label. The album received mediocre reviews, mostly critiquing the unfinished sound. In my opinion, it ranks amongst the worst of his career, and I almost feel bad that it was released, because the album before it was so good that it would have been such a nice ending note for his career. I wouldn't really recommend this to anyone for any reason, aside from the fact that it's his final release. Though the 3 songs I recommend from it are Tin Soldier, Chromatic Love Affair, and Kicks. Those are all the albums Duke Ellington released, at least all the studio albums he released in his career. He had a lot of live albums, but I'm not going to cover those. So who did Duke Ellington influence? Well, a lot of people. He really revolutionized the sound of jazz. He was a huge figure, not only just in jazz, but in music in general, and I'm sure a lot of artists could credit him. Though, some of the most acclaimed ones that have been publicly cited are Charles Mingus, Gerald Wilson, and Quincy Jones. Duke Ellington died on May 24th, 1974 of lung cancer and pneumonia. His funeral was held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And his last words were, "Music is how I live, why I live, and how I will be remembered." He also married young in 1918, far before his album career started, to his high school sweetheart, Edna Thompson, and they shared Duke's only child. He later became the companion of Mildred Dixon, who inspired such songs like Sophisticated Lady. His last love, publicly documented, was Beatrice Ellis, who he abandoned his family for in 1938. In his credit, his family was pretty grown by then. His son was 19 years old, and moved in with her. Rest in peace to a legend. He was one of the greatest musicians of all time, and has since doing this episode become one of my favorites. I could really appreciate everything he tried, everything he influenced that I can now hear in other artists that have since come, and everything he was as a person. For on many accounts, it seemed like he was described as a good guy. And if you'd like to hear again the songs of his I believe to be especially essential, use the Spotify link that I'll post in the comments. I'll probably pin it so you can see it, like I said. It's pretty long, and I think it's worth listening to if you really want to get a good grasp of what's so great about Duke Ellington, because it's kind of hard to get into him when he has so many albums. Regardless if you do or you don't, thank you for listening. If you made it all this way, I'm impressed. I appreciate it. Subscribe and like if you'd like to. And expect more, because I'm going to be planning on releasing more stuff. Hopefully with smaller discographies, so you'll get more videos more often, rather than just shorts. But I'm excited, and I hope you guys are too. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.